Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Let's Talk About It podcast. As you'll probably notice throughout the course of this episode, I'm alone and there is no special guest or co-host with me today. So I'm kind of experimenting this new style of just talking one-on-one with you. And some people might say that it could get a little bit boring, but I feel like this platform allows me to freely talk about the topic without the need of a time restraint. So yeah, I hope this kind of style sticks around and you guys come to like it. It's a little bit different and it might take some adjusting to get used to only hearing one voice. But hopefully this changes for the better. And if it's not, you guys can let me know in that comment section as well. But this episode is going to be centered around the value of money. And what I mean by this is ultimately how people perceive money and whether it's one of the biggest controlling factors in a person's life, which we'll kind of get onto. But in order for me to kind of talk about this topic, I first need to tell you a story. So growing up, I never really felt like I lived the East London experience. And what I mean by this is East London is known to be one of the poorer areas in London, and I felt like not a lot of people lived the way I did. And that's not me saying that I was ever wealthy, because I wasn't, but at the same time I never once in my life felt like I was ever struggling, and that's probably how a lot of people in my area do. So I consider myself to be very fortunate in that regard, and that's in large part due to my parents. And if we ever were struggling, I think they did a pretty good job in hiding the fact that we were. And as much as that did benefit us in life, it also had its cons. Now I know you're probably thinking, it sounds like such a big first world problem. Like, how could you really be complaining about your life when you didn't grow up like everybody else around you? But that's kind of the point that I'm going to make throughout this episode, and I hope it becomes clear by the end of it. And the one major con of living that way was the fact that we kind of became ignorant and, in a sense, arrogant to the value of money. And looking back at it now, I think I grew up expecting nice things on birthdays and on Christmases because that's all I ever really knew. And that affected me later on in my life in ways that I didn't even know at the time. In the sense that I was kind of viewed as the rich, arrogant kid with money. And don't get me wrong, I was never the type to throw any tantrums when things didn't come my way. But eventually, I felt like I always got what I had asked for. So I felt like that made me very distant with not only friends but even some people in my family, because they would be so surprised that I got the newest console that came out, the newest phone that came out, and I never really took into account how that might look from an outsider perspective because I was so indulged in what I already had. And as I grew older, I did kind of get a little bit more of an understanding of how money works, but still I felt like I was ignorant to the entire thing because I knew that if I ever needed money, I would always get it. And yeah, I did do the typical teenager thing of saving up your lunch money to go out on the weekends with your friends. But I didn't know how much more of an easier road I had compared to some of the other kids around me. And I lived my life like that for a very, very long time. And the only time that ever really changed for me was university. Now, if you guys have heard the first episode, you would kind of understand how it was a maturing stage for me. And that's one of the things that I am grateful for when I talk about my whole experience in Derby. So, a little background on my experience at university. I received about 1.4k for maintenance loan, and when I first joined university, my rent was, I believe, around 800ish per quarter. Now, I know some of you listening are probably going to be like, that is stupid cheap. And you're right, yeah, it was cheap. But I think over time, as rent started to get more and more expensive, I really felt the pressure of learning how to save. And the thing about me is, although, yes, like I told you, I did get all the stuff that I wanted when I wanted it, there was also this feeling of guilt when it came to asking for those things. And over the years, people used to tell me the age old saying, if you don't ask, you don't get. But I think the guilt that came along with that was what made me very hesitant to ask for these things when I was younger, because I didn't really feel like I was deserving enough of them. Because at the end of the day, I kind of knew what the cost of getting that thing was for me. That was taking overtime shifts, working 40 hours, doing back to backs, having sleepless nights. Like, all of that came into account when I would think about, do I really need to ask for this? So, oftentimes, when the rent would come due and I would only have £300 to £400 in my bank account to last me the duration of the semester, I really started to focus on living on the essentials. And like I spoke about in the last episode, I didn't necessarily live the typical university life, which was going out every week with your friends. Not like I was that kind of person anyway, but I feel like one of the reasons why I never really did it was because I could never really afford it. And don't get me wrong, my parents would always ask me whether I needed any more money to live off of. But again, that guilt really got to me to the point where I would reject it and live the most basic life possible. Which is not to say a bad thing, but sometimes I missed out on opportunities simply because I was so focused on how much money I had at the time and whether going out would be a smarter financial decision than staying in and cooking your own food, for example. And it got really bad to the point where I would walk everywhere because I knew that I wasn't going to pay bus fares or pay for a cab to get somewhere when my legs work. And I don't know whether the guilt I was talking about when it comes to asking for money was really guilt, because now that I kind of think about it, it seemed like an element of pride. And I think that I was so prideful that I would have to convince myself and everybody else around me that I was okay and that I did have enough money to make it through the end of the semester without reaching out for anybody's help. And like I told you before, as a kid I had this reputation of being the rich one, the one who could always get everything he wanted. So when that time came for when I actually needed to ask for things, people would always tell me, oh yeah, don't worry about it. Like, you can ask your parents, you can ask your grandparents, whatever, they will cover you. But then when you live with that kind of reputation basically all your life, like, I started to get really tired of hearing that, because it felt kind of embarrassing to always want to reach out to people, because to me, I had never worked a day in my life, so why am I the entitled one asking for XYZ? Like, I really felt like I had to earn it. And while that mindset is quite good to have, just in terms of being financially responsible, there's also an element of missing out on experiences. So for a long time, I felt like money was the central decision maker for my life, and it controlled so many aspects of how I lived on a day-to-day basis, which sounds quite simplistic, but it also kind of fed into me developing indecisiveness, because I would always have to question whether one, it's worth it, and two, whether I could even afford it. So what did I do? I got a job, like most people who need the money would do. And I'm not saying that getting a job was the problem, because that makes me sound lazy and undeserving. But where it gets complicated is the things I was willing to do in order to get money. My first ever job was an usher at the cinema, and I was paid £5.50, or whatever the national minimum wage was at the time. This was all the way back in 2017, so it was way low back then. And I'll admit, getting the first couple of paychecks did feel very rewarding, but I never really realized the extent that I would go to in order to earn some money. Looking back at it now, I was probably way overworked, but at the time I didn't care, because at least I had something in my pocket. But I'm going to share with you guys the total amount that I made over the 3 months of working. I made £1,200 for 3 months of working there. And I was happy, because at least I could actually buy the things I was able to buy without feeling the guilt of asking my parents for money. I felt like I'd actually earned what I had gotten. And after that job at the cinema, I didn't really work throughout university, because obviously I had more important things to focus on. So fast forwarding to last year, where I had just graduated and now was on the whole postgraduate hunt. And like I mentioned in the previous episode, I had a lot of trouble looking for my postgraduate career. But because of the existential pressure that exists in today's culture, where you have to earn as quickly as possible, and truth be told, a lot of that pressure came from seeing other people get straight into higher paying jobs while I was sitting at home not really doing anything. And to me that was quite embarrassing, knowing that I was still sitting at home doing nothing whilst other people my age were out there getting graduate roles and actually making a living. And I know a lot of people are probably going to think that I'm still young, and loads of people's careers don't really get started until way later in their life. But in this day and age where you hear it everywhere, you hear it in rap songs, like making it from rags to riches, and even no scrubs. Like, the idea that somebody would reject you because you aren't making enough money to satisfy them, it kind of really shows you how money's the center of everybody's attention. And in all fairness, I don't really blame them, because everybody wants a luxurious life. Everybody wants to own the things that they want. But what I had to realize is, it doesn't become worth it if it's at the extent of your overall happiness. And that was a big lesson for me, because going back to that postgraduate time, I settled for working in the hospitality and retail sector just to make some money. And not a lot of people know this, but one of my biggest regrets was turning down a journalistic opportunity that was everything I wanted career-wise. For those of you who don't know, my ultimate career goal is to be a sports writer. And thanks to the help of one of my university friends, she actually found an opportunity for me. And I got to speaking with the organization about writing for them eventually. And this was a freelance contract, so I would get paid article by article. But where I went wrong was not committing enough to the long-term goal that I had in mind, just because of how much money they were willing to pay me. This company was a small startup one, and whilst they were willing to pay me some amount of money, I didn't see it as enough. So what ended up happening was I had to balance an interview for a role in hospitality or get paid X amount as a small-time sports writer for a small-time company. And as you can probably guess, I made the wrong decision and worked in the hospitality sector. And that's no disrespect to people who are currently living check to check, because I understand it, and it's highly respectable for you to do that in order to earn a living. But for me, I never ever thought that I would put my career to the back seat in order to gain a couple of pounds. And whilst this job did pay decent, the hours were extremely long. And so I ended up with this extreme regret of not choosing what I actually wanted to do. And you would have thought I'd learned my lesson by now, but no, I didn't. I left the hospitality job soon after, when the hours just kind of started to become overbearing for me. And I left for a better paying job, this time in retail. And whilst it was really good to begin with, I experienced the same problem. Although I was getting a lot of money at the time, I kind of felt like the hours were getting a bit too hectic and I didn't have enough time for myself. Because truthfully, I didn't. If you ask anybody, I might as well have just pulled the mattress out and slept in the damn stockroom because of how much I was working. And yeah, I did need money, but I didn't need money that much. Like, it really got to the point where I was living to work and not working to live. So at that time, life felt really robotic, in the sense that I would just wake up, sleep, go to work, and repeat the whole cycle. So my whole concept of what an ideal adult life was became super corrupted, just because I wanted to earn enough to where I felt I could live happily. So it's kind of ironic how life took this complete 180, where I was once seen as the kid who got everything he wants, to now the kid who doesn't want to spend to get everything he wants. And I don't know whether it's a culture thing, but the way I grew up was, and I feel like a lot of Asian people are going to have my back on this one, but you cannot have more than 2 lights on in the house. You can't run the water for too long, and if you're cold, get a blanket because there ain't no damn way the heating's coming on unless you A, start to see your breath, or B, literally get frostbite. But yeah, that was literally my life. That's what I knew to be true. So I kind of took those things with me when I moved out and started to live on my own, because I felt the repercussions of what it was like to run the water for too long, or have the heating on for too long, or not plug every single cable out of the sockets. And I felt like in large part it did teach me fundamental lessons about how to really stretch your money. But at the same time, the negative impact that it did bring onto me was greed. I think over time I started to really hold onto my money so tight that I wouldn't want to spend it on anything or anyone, and that affected a lot of my friendships and relationships, because I would always try to choose the cheaper option, and my morals just wasn't fair to the people I was with. And my dad always told me growing up that money doesn't matter when it comes to food, but during that time where I was unemployed and I wasn't getting steady income, but I still had money in my bank account, I wouldn't choose to even get food because I knew that I would be losing it. So I feel like whilst the lesson that I was being taught by my parents was a good one at heart, the message wasn't fed back to me the way it was supposed to, and it affected me in a negative way. And it still does. Like, if you ask anybody around me, I'm still known as the cheapskate. My family is still known as the ones who won't spend money unless it's necessary. And I know that a lot of times it is just fun and games, and it is very funny to laugh about how strict we are, especially how strict I am with how I see money. But I feel like a lot of jokes are rooted within the truth. So, whilst it is a joke, I can't sit there and say that's completely false and I'm not a cheapskate. You know what I'm saying? And that's something that I don't want to do, and I don't think anybody should do. And I think one of the things I wanted to stress is don't let the pressure get to you. I think it's important for people to understand that people's lives don't move at the same pace, and that's okay, because your time will come eventually. And I would also recommend just not to be too consumed in everything you see and hear, because that can really eat you up inside. And I kind of had to learn that the hard way. Like, obviously you heard about the job that I took in order to get money, the extent I was willing to go to in order to obtain the things I wanted to get. One of the quotes that really stuck with me is a quote by J. Cole, who basically said, like, there's no amount of money that will ever make you stop if money's what you care about. Like, you'll always have target goals for yourself, and eventually you'll find that you're selling yourself out because you're working so much to the point where you're not even living life anymore. And I also wanted to address my biggest issue, something that I've still been dealing with today, is don't be greedy. One of the things that I learned is that money will always come back. So if you're thinking about whether you should go out and experience something with your friends and family, or save that money, spend it because you don't get those moments back. And at the end of the day, you can't take money with you when you die. So, what is the point? However, that does not mean that money ultimately buys happiness, because that is wrong. You can find enjoyment in the simplistic things without having to go to luxurious places and do luxurious things. So basically, life is all about balance. Like, as cliche as it sounds, you have to know what the right amount is. Yes, if you do want to buy yourself nice things, go right ahead. That's more than welcome. If you feel like it will bring some satisfaction to your life, but understand that it's not the end all be all. And just because you have those things doesn't mean A, you're better than anybody else, but B, if you don't have those things, doesn't mean you're missing out. So this brings us to the end of the story, where I'm at right now. If you were looking for a happy ending, it's not here. Not yet, at least. After that job that I just told you about, I left because of how overbearing the hours were, and I joined another job, still in retail, but this time I learnt my lessons. I took this job solely on the fact that I could get less hours and have more time for myself, whilst I could still focus on achieving other projects like the one you're hearing. And I think it's really benefited me mentally. I feel like by making this decision, yes, I am losing out on the potential amount of money I could get by working every single day of the week. But then I would just be repeating the cycle again. Another opportunity that I did want to bring up was the unpaid internships that I mentioned in episode 1. I did do 2 unpaid internships for journalism just after I had graduated. But again, the whole pressure of making money really affected my decision in staying and ultimately leaving. And I remember one of the co-founders at the time telling me, don't stay out of the journalistic industry for too long, because otherwise you won't know how to find your way back in. And at the time, I didn't take on board what he was saying because it felt like just a needless attempt to keep me on board. But now I kind of do understand that if you were so consumed by earning money, then you'll kind of get lost in everything you're doing in order to obtain it. So that's another thing that I would kind of tell myself. Don't chase the bag, because eventually it will come to you if you're deserving of it. Because you have to really be willing to work and sacrifice things, in this case, money, for a journalistic opportunity to eventually end up where you want to be. And it's okay to admit sometimes that you are broke. There's no shame in that. I think people should take more accountability for when they really cannot do things. Because the problem I had was saying I couldn't do things, but not because I didn't have the money to do them, but because I didn't want to do them, which wasn't always the case. So ultimately, just let that pride go and live life however you want to live it. But that's going to wrap up today's episode. I know a lot of you are probably wondering, what the hell was that? What the hell was he even talking about? And I know I was rambling on for quite some time, but I hope that you can really understand my viewpoint, and maybe we can debate this in the comments. But if you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the little bell icon to be notified about when every video gets posted. But until then, take care and goodbye.